In 2015, many of us found ourselves in an existential crisis, questioning what we believed and if we even could trust the innermost functions of our own minds. In 2015, we experienced the great internet debate of the dress. For those not familiar, a photo circulated around the internet of a striped dress on a hanger. Some people looked at the photo and saw a white and gold dress, and others looked at the exact same picture and saw blue and black. Or does anyone remember the great debate of this past spring with Yanny and Laurel? A voice recording spread across the internet of a single word, and in that single word, some people heard the name Yanny, and some people heard Laurel. These debates, the dress, and the recording became huge. They were topics of conversation at work, in schools. I heard many a sermon given from the bema exploring the phenomenon. We were enamored, partly because it was fun and frivolous in what is often a very serious world. But in both cases, people fervently believed that what they saw or what they heard was the only possibility. How could anyone see a blue and black dress? It is so clearly white and gold. You hear Laurel? You're wrong. They're obviously saying Yanny. Of course, there is one right answer. It is my answer, and there is no room for anyone to convince me otherwise. This week in our Torah portion, Ki Tavo, Moses instructs the people about how to go to the temple and bring offerings. They were to take the first fruits of their harvest, bring them to Jerusalem, and make a declaration. This declaration, detailed in our parashah this week, is considered by the Chief Rabbi of England, Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, to be the first moment that the people of Israel became a nation of storytellers. The declaration, as written out in Deuteronomy 26, reads, Arami Oved Avi. My father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down into Egypt and lived there, few in number, there becoming a great nation, powerful and numerous. But the Egyptians ill-treated us and made us suffer, subjecting us to harsh labor. Then we cried out to God, the God of our ancestors, and God heard our voice and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. So God brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders. So standing at the great temple with our first fruit offering, we are instructed to give this declaration that tells the story of our people. We begin with Arami Oved Avi. My father was a wandering Aramean, a wandering man from the region of Aram. This phrase appears in many places within our tradition. And often we find the concept of our collective father as a wandering Aramean used to understand the struggles of other peoples, or in discussions about immigration or refugees. This line, though, is also central to our Passover Haggadah. It appears in many Haggadot with this understanding, and yet in others, there is a different reading of the verse. Some Haggadot don't read, Arami Oved Avi, my father was a wandering Aramean, but rather read, Arami Ibed Avi, my father was destroyed by an Aramean. Oved, Ibed, two plausible ways to read the same Hebrew word, differentiated only by the way we add vowels to the Hebrew letters, differentiated by little dots and lines. Oved and Ibed, two ways to read the exact same Hebrew word, but they give us completely different meanings, different understandings, and different contexts to our story. How easy it is to understand the same thing in very different ways. There's a Jewish parable in which 4 blind men stumble upon an elephant. The story goes that the first man touches the elephant's leg and says, this must be a tree trunk we've stumbled upon. And the second man grabs the elephant's tail and says, no, this in fact is a whip. And the third man grabs hold of the elephant's trunk and says, this is a hose. And the fourth man reaches out and touches the elephant's side and says, no, this is not a tree trunk or a whip or a hose. This is clearly a wall. These men arrived upon the elephant and used what they had, their knowledge, their past experiences, their conception of the world, to determine what their truth was. And in the end, they each found their own truth, and not a one of them lined up, teaching us that there are many ways to understand the same thing. Ironically, this parable actually appears in multiple cultures and religions, and with each appearance, it is different. There are 4 men, or 5, or 6. They touch pieces of the elephant and find a fan, a pipe, a rope. In Jainism, in the Jain tradition's version of the story, one man finds the hairy end of the tail and determines that this elephant must be a mouse. So here we have many ways to tell the story about how there are many ways to understand the same thing. When we have a discrepancy, sometimes there is a right answer. The blind men were objectively touching an elephant. And sometimes it's not so neat and clean. Is my father a wandering Aramean, or was he destroyed by an Aramean? Right or wrong, or something in between. When we find ourselves with a difference of perspective or even a misunderstanding before us, what we have to push ourselves to do is to seek to understand. My grandfather of blessed memory always used to say that some people get all their exercise by jumping to conclusions. Each of the blind men assumed that he was right and that those around him were wrong. They jumped to a conclusion. But what if the story had gone differently? If the man who felt a tree trunk and the man who felt a hose had asked some follow-up questions? Why do you think it's a tree trunk? Describe how it feels. How did you get to that answer? Tell me more. Had the blind men worked together, had they reached beyond their own certainties and sought to understand, they probably could have figured it out. It's an elephant. What would it look like if we did less reacting in the moment and more thinking? If we paused, took a breath, and asked a question. Tomorrow evening, we will mark Slichot, a time where we think about repentance, about forgiveness, about where we went wrong in this past year. How many disagreements could have been avoided with a pause, a breath, and a follow-up question? Who in this past year has found themselves going around in circles with your partner or your child or your friend, arguing and arguing, only to realize you're actually saying the same thing? We take a moment where we agree with one another and build up such a cloud of frustration and annoyance that we can't see through it to the truth. Pause, breathe, ask. It's so simple and also one of the most challenging things to do. So this coming year, in the year 5779, may each of us have the strength to do this holy act, to think more and react less, to seek to understand over all else. And then maybe 5779 will be the year in which we find fewer tree trunks and more elephants. Shabbat Shalom.